If someone was driving their wagon through an alleyway by your house, would you go to the great lengths to build a 7.5-foot wide house just to get them to stop?
I might just build a gate, put a gate.
This time of year, you'll find many folks about town in the holiday spirit, but for all those who are merry and bright, there are still a few Scrooges who prefer to say, bah humbug, or more precisely, not in my backyard. This is a story about the latter.
Well, it's kind of cute. I mean, I can't imagine living in a house that tiny, but you know, it's unique.
We are standing just across the street from 523 Queen Street.
Also known as Old Town's Spite House, built in the heart of historic Alexandria, Virginia by a man named John Hollinsbury in the 1830s.
Looks even smaller up close, like in person.
Standing 2 meager stories high, dwarfed by larger homes on either side, the deep blue bricks and yellow accents around the window frames stand out today.
When this house was built, it was part of the District of Columbia.
Allow me to introduce a new Mad About Town recurring guest, Dan Lee with the city of Alexandria. We'll call him Historian Dan.
At one time, it was considered the narrowest house in the United States.
I mean, I feel like I could like lay down like crossways.
Across it, yes. You
and
could,
I would be...
You would touch one side and touch the other.
At just 7.5 feet wide and 14 feet deep, Dan says the Spite House builder, our esteemed Mr. Hollinsbury, built it with one purpose in mind.
To spite the people who were hitting his house with their wagons.
The story goes like this. Hollinsbury owned the property next door, 525 Queen Street, back in the day. He also owned the alleyway in between himself and his next door neighbor. And after months, perhaps years of locals like his neighbor using his alley as a shortcut, banging across the cobblestones and along the walls of his home with their oversized horse carriages and wagons, he said, enough is enough.
Stop at the local tavern, drink a little bit, get in your wagon, you know, drinking and wagoning, probably not the best thing.
One might guess, like, how can you do that legally? And it helped that he was on the city council. And he built bricks.
So he pretty much just said, I'm doing this, and no one stopped him.
No one stopped him.
I love that.
On some level, I admire the pettiness.
Not only that, but the dedication from subsequent owners to maintain it.
That's right, it's still a residence today. Dan says it's owned by a family in Montana and listed at a mere $682,000 big ones. A bargain in Old Town, if you ask me, even if it is narrower than the wingspan of your favorite NBA player.
You don't think something like this could be built nowadays, potentially?
I do not.
And yet, this isn't actually the only one.
How many of these are there around town?
So we generally recognize 4.
The catch is the other 3 spots aren't necessarily spite houses.
There's a lot of alleys throughout all of, you know, Old Town.
The more I walked around, the more I realized residents like Lisa were right.
You know, Dan, I get it now.
The other 3 properties on historic streets like Prince and King are known as alley houses, and Dan says they had other, more practical purposes.
In some cases, it seemed like they were built maybe perhaps like the way we would make an in-laws, like cottage or cabin.
And not as spiteful, perhaps.
No, and a little bit wider. I believe it's 8 feet wide.
A whole half a foot, man. Real estate doesn't come cheap nowadays.
Yeah.
Through my exploration of Old Town's alleys, I realized 2 things. The first being that when it comes to this area,
there probably are more historical places than meet the eye.
And finally, even if something was built once upon a time purely out of spite,
real estate in Old Town is really expensive, and if you can grab even like the smallest amount, go for it.
On that note, here in Old Town, I'm Matt Kaufax with Dan, WTOP News.